Muito boa tarde a todos. Muito boa tarde a todos. Welcome to the Brazil and Latin American panel. I will switch to Portuguese because this session will be in Portuguese. Muito bem-vindos ao...
Welcome to the panel on Brazil and Latin America. As you know, this panel has a tradition in the Estoril Political Forum for many years. The idea is to bring you some of the best experts on Brazil, academics, public intellectuals, pundits, that will help us understand not just the current situation in Brazil, but the path that Brazil will take. Now, no need to say that in the last years, Brazil has been the focus of international politics. First with the PT government, now with the Bolsonaro government, Brazil is still making the headlines, facing its challenges, and this panel has always been an important key to understand what is happening in Brazilian politics, but also, as I said, the path that Brazil will take. And we know that there will be presidential elections next year in 2022, and our guest speakers tonight will help us understand what 2022 may bring. So let me give the floor to Bruno Gertrugen. He has a degree in law, a master's in political science and international relations by this institute. He's taking his PhD here. Bruno is in São Paulo. There is earlier. Bruno, you have the floor. Hello, good afternoon. Thank you, Professor Coutinho. First, let me thank the Director of Political Studies, Professor João Carlos Espada, also Dr. Rita Seabra Brito for the excellent organization, and the other professors and faculty of IPT. That's my alma mater. Now, let me take the suggestion of Professor Coutinho showing the importance of this panel to clarify, to put into context, and to present concepts and perspectives and approaches about the most relevant political issues in international relations as regards Brazil, and how Brazil fits in the international community at large. Throughout the years, this panel has been extremely important for us to make this explanation and to have a debate about political phenomena and problems, challenges and opportunities that Brazil is facing, not just within the scope of the political institutions, but mainly within the political and social phenomena that take place in society. Now, to end this participation of mine, let me emphasize that at a time when Brazil is experiencing not a new but another crisis, another political issue that may affect the lives of each and every one of us. A political crisis is always followed by economic problems. So debates like this one that we have in the Estoril Political Forum, these discussions are extremely important, so that we may understand not just the political situation in Brazil, but the issues, challenges, and opportunities that Brazil can face. So I immediately give the floor to Gabriel Torres, the chair of this panel, to introduce the speakers. Thank you, and I wish you a great event. Thank you, Bruno. Thank you, Coutinho. Thank you all. First, let me thank the organizers and Professor Espada in particular for having invited us to the Business Studies Institute, the institution I preside, to participate in the Estoril Political Forum. I was thinking about the title of this panel, Brazil and Latin America, the challenges ahead. And I think that the greatest challenges that Brazil and Latin America they are not ahead. They are already with us. It's the same we have been facing for some years now. So everyone talks about issues in Brazil, problems in Brazil, Latin America, and tries to find the roots. And we understand that in reality, causes are very similar, the same basic causes as ever. Lack of institutions, of rules, of qualified rules, and inclusive rules. And when I mean inclusive, not in the perverted way that the left has been using this word, just poor resources in the population and it will solve all the problems. But in the sense of liberal tradition, rule of law, rights and liberties, and I'm sure that the speakers today will help us clarify these points. So I give the floor back to João Pereira Coutinho to introduce the speakers. Thank you. Thank you. So let's start this session with the speakers. Let me follow the order in the program. So the first speaker is Antonio Roberto Batista. He has a degree in medicine, where he has worked as a doctor and professor for many years. At the same time, he has developed an activity as a publisher and a commentator, pundit. Antonio, you have the floor. Thank you. Well, first and foremost, it is a honor to be here in this group. I'm not being original, but I'm being honest. And the initial this presentation, I'm very pleased about to speak because when we speak about democracy in Brazil and Latin America, and I will speak mostly about Brazil. It's my country. I know better. In the rest of Latin America, I am not so much aware of, but I tried to list some threats to democracy. In this panel, we have praised so much democracy, and this is something we all share, but we should also share the idea that we have to be prudent and look and be aware of the threats. And these threats are precisely in what has just been mentioned. These problems do not appear out of nothing overnight. They have a history behind them, how they came about and why they still remain as challenges to all of us. So I listed, as I said, some of those threats, and I remind you that we are talking about a democratic regime under the perception or the conception of the Western world culture, a system based in institutions, well-established institutions, based in laws that have been approved to uphold certain values and representation. And this requires investment in the quality of the elite so that this process may have a continuity. So the main objective of democracy, as it has been said here, is the expansion, preservation, protection of human freedom, political freedom in particular, but also the other individual essential freedoms that have been perfected throughout with a system perfected throughout the years. Now, the challenges I'm going to mention, all of them are present everywhere. The thing is that in those societies with solid institutions, with a more consistent development, an in-depth, more deepened democracy, these threats are almost residual. They are just like a footnote of the political and social lives. But in some countries that are more unstable, as it is the case of Latin America and of Brazil in particular, these threats become more acute, more visible, more urgent to be faced. The first typical threat that I have in my list and appears in the interpretation of many Brazilian authors that want to understand the Brazilian phenomenon, and a lot could be said in detail about this phenomenon, but I'm not going to get into that detail. So this is what we call a patronizing state. A patronizing state is a category that is very present, and it explains a lot of the Brazilian reality and has been studied by many authors in our specialized literature, from the classic Raimundo Faoro, with the Owners of Power, his book he wrote, and some well-known authors here in Portugal, or here at the Institute. They were here before. Professor Antonio Paim, he was one of the he studied much this subject, and recently he participated in a webinar with us, and I'm talking about Professor Ricardo Vélez Rodrigues. Well, is Colombian-born, but Brazilian citizen for many years. So this patrimonialism or patronizing state, the confusion, the misunderstanding between public and private, that leads to many problems, an open door to corruption, which is an ever-growing concern in Brazil. Not really long ago, we were we had the world record on the matter, with all these parasites of the state almost set up as a machine that was later dismantled. But let's see how much has it been dismantled, this corruption machine. But this patronizing state is always present, and it should be an object of constant concern. Paim always wondered, we will ever be able to bury the patronizing state? Second threat to democracy is populism. Populism is very, very visible in many countries of Latin America. Maybe even more than in Brazil, where populism almost ravaged through those countries. The great feat of populism is the disaster it has caused for decades in Argentina, a country that was almost doomed for success. Yes, so many comparative advantages in all aspects, including in culture. Unlike Brazil, Argentina has won Nobel Prizes. They have more bookstores in Buenos Aires than in the whole of Brazil, for instance. The most fertile land in the world. So the advantages are immense. But unfortunately, they are not made use of, because populism was so embedded in the political attitude in Argentina. And now we have the example of Venezuela. In Brazil, populism, we also have populism. The current government has evident traits of populism. Not that destroying populism. I think there is an exaggeration made about the current Brazilian policy, but in any way, the trait, the feature, is populist, meaning that there is an attempt to have a direct contact between the leader and the population, overseeing the importance of the institutions, and that is the main damage that populism causes to the political pattern in a country. Another aspect is the imbalance of checks and balances. Checks and balances without which we cannot have a true democracy, where the power is fragmented in an intelligent manner. This is well known by everyone because it is part of the basis of the democratic politics. Now, another thing that is sometimes neglected by political scientists. Political scientists do not like to discuss their intellectually elegant debate. They don't like to discuss the illegal, the organized crime, namely based on drug trafficking. Now, this is a very serious Latin American problem. We cannot just say it is a police or public health issue. Now, I am a doctor by training, so I would like it just to be approached and approachable in the public health perspective. But it's more than that. This problem affects severely the politics because it compromises the powers and the institutions, because they also interfere in the judicial powers. They create intimidations that inhibit the democratic governance, and it compromises people's ownership, and so it leads to social disruption. And it ends up having a very serious political repercussion in Latin America. And we have to be very serious about this. Brazil has been a route of traffic. Now we are a route, consumers and producers of drugs. And it's the issue of the hot potato. People would rather not look, because if they turn a blind eye, because otherwise they would have to do something about it. But I want to stress this because it is usually forgotten in political analysis and it should not be forgotten. It also compromises human capital, the development of elites. We cannot have a good democracy without an elite which is up to the task. Finally, the fifth threat, this is a more universal threat, and it is today present all over the world for several reasons, is the commitment of freedom of expression, freedom of speech. The freedom of speech is at stake and in danger throughout the world. It is one of the main polemic today. There was a playwright or a Brazilian intellectual called Milor Fernandes. Maybe some of you have heard about him, and he used to always use the word. The freedom of thinking is just to be able to think. This was an irony about the freedom of speech, a bit related to the period of authoritarian governments we had some decades ago. And freedom of speech is inherent to democracy, and it is a must of democracy. It is the vital organ of democracy. If it is hurt, then the whole organism, the democratic organism, will be compromised. Without freedom of speech, there is no democracy. So valuing freedom of speech and some prudence about this is important as well. Now, maybe one of the main reasons that this is so present today is the expansion of the electronic media. At first, and correctly so, they were seen as a way of expanding the people's freedom of speech. But it also gained the interest and greed of all controllers on the face of Earth. The governments, the oligopolies of information, of the media. Well, maybe they already existed, but we were just not so much aware of them. And today, there is not the classic censorship with a human face, the guy that just goes and forbids something from being published, as I could see when I was a young man, and when I went through the archives of the São Paulo newspaper during the military censorship. They started censoring news about terrorist acts, a bomb that exploded here, a bank robbery over there. So that's how they started, with this kind of censorship. And then they ended up censorship even the lyrics of a samba song, because the censorship, it becomes alive. It becomes alive. Now we are again being censored by algorithms that they don't even have a human face, these algorithms. So depending on what you say, you can be cancelled from the social media. You can disappear. So I think I'm going to stop here because I still have 2 minutes. Okay, in my last 2 minutes, I will give you a happy end. I can't just talk about things that are bad. Otherwise, you say I'm a party pooper. Everyone is celebrating democracy here, and somebody says, no, but tomorrow you have to wake up, so don't drink any more beer. So he's the party pooper. But the happy end is the following. In Brazil, what we have been watching, despite all problems, undeniable problems, and studied, and we sometimes say that Brazil is not for amateurs. It is, this is a typical Brazilian statement. Brazil is not for amateurs because it is very complicated to be interpreted, very difficult to understand for many reasons. Not that the other countries are easy to understand, but we Brazilians, we think that Brazil is really a complicated country. But the population, one way or another, sometimes in a rather clumsy way and with little knowledge about political issues. The level of training and education of the population is very variable. But the population is rather convinced that the only way out is a democracy. The only solution to Brazil is to be a democracy. And I hope this will prevail because other more qualified in cultural terms than Brazil have already fallen in very terrible situations. The classic is Germany. How Germany is such a fantastic country in great culture, great population, all that. How did they fall in Nazism? Well, it's hard to understand, but it happened. So I hope that we already have an information level which is sufficient for this embracing of democracy to prevail with time. And that the solution be built, thinking about Kafka's quote that the greatest mistakes of humanity are always because we rushed into them, and so we should not rush into things and understand that technology is what we want it to be. Thank you for your attention.
Muito obrigado, António, pelas palavras e por
Very much, Antonio, for these words and for your capacity of synthesis of the five great issues that the Brazilian democracy has to address. Now, let's going to listen to Leonidas Zaimanovic, our man in Liberty Fund. He's got a degree in economy. He's got an MA and a PhD in applied economics in the University Rey Juan Carlos in Madrid. He's written books, Ontology and Function of Money, The Representation of Theory, and Capital. Leonidas, you have the floor. Good afternoon. My reflection are based on the history of political representation in Brazil in the cases of people tuteled people's sovereignty. In 1822, the Brazil became independent thanks to the first emperor. The emperor gave to the Brazil in 1824 its first constitution, and then we had a constitutional monarchy, a rather liberal regime, and in fact Brazil had a colonial status until 1808. That regime could be called liberal, and as far as a slavery country could be called liberal. And we had four powers: executive, legislative, judicial, and a cabinet nominated by the emperor, and a moderating power exercised personally by the emperor. And I would like to say that this arrangement stayed with us until today, as many aspects of the permanent constitution of Brazil, such as paternalism, the bureaucratic system, and also financial repression. Possibly the period of regency from 1831 to 1840 was the last period of Brazilian history in which there was no guardian supervising the exercise of people's democracy by parliament. Once the majority of Peter II, who was only 13, was declared, the moderating power was re-established. In 1879, monarchy was dethroned by a military coup, and the government became a federal republic with a representative government, and there was presidentialism. And in most part of the republic, the moderating power was exercised by the armed forces, and this lasted until very recently. Military intervention in national politics from 1937, new state, confirmed this, and 75, the transfer of power to Juscelino Kubitschek, and the revolution of 1964 are examples of that. Not talking about military interventions in local conflicts. Even the gradual return to a representative government in 1985 started in 1977 through a decision of the military command. Supposedly, the what left to the impeachment of its successor and the imprisonment of Lulu and other elements of his criminal gang were made possible by the supervision of the military, the army, to see that the legal arrangements could be uh, obeyed. But recently, the Supreme Court in Brazil, as in more mature democracies, assumed this role of arbiter of the political game, and the Supreme Court has went over the limits of its judicial power and assumed some of the attributions of the moderating power against some measures which were more antagonistic by the elected power. What we are seeing now is not a regular exercise of the judicial attributions of the Supreme Court as to give an opinion on the an opinion on we have a court inclining the balance of justice in order to reach political objectives which are desirable, but if that they be believed to be opportune, taking into account the present situation in Brazil. In fact, they behave as if checks and balances established by the existing constitutional norms would not be enough to prevent the political life to become completely deteriorated. They see themselves as exercising adult supervision on the other powers, apart from the limits of its own judicial limit. The same thing that the emperor did during the monarchy and also the army during the republic until recently. And I would argue that is against the written constitutional norm. There's nothing in the Brazilian constitution, even in Article 102, which deals with the Supreme Court, or Article 42, deals with the armed force, which confers such responsibility to the Supreme Court. Even the procurators have the right to do something which is not the strict control of the acts of the political agents. Any other things about is an abuse of power. We could also argue that the real constitution, the non-written constitution, has a lot of characteristics which are not part of our institutional formal arrangements. However, they do exist as financial repression, just to give an example. Secondly, we can also wonder whether this tutelage is really indispensable. Our political agents are so corrupted, and our electors are so ingenuous. How can they prevent the elite to place itself above the elite? Would this precipitate the collapse of the system? Who guards the guard? Even if we give the most purest intentions to the emperor in the past, to the generals and to the... Is it possible that they do not get involved in the political debate? And this is considered the same about the Supreme Court. Even if division of powers requires another division than the traditional one, that does not mean that a power could be superior or have more authority than the others. I think that the prerogative of starting suits against judicial suits against the state are so prone to abuses that they, under an adult constitution, they should be considered as separate powers and not part of the executive power. And I think that a lot of the problems in Western democracies today are due by abdication of power. But in Brazil, attempts to moderate powers indicate that the powers in Brazil are more powerful than people think. In Brazil, there are clear signs of abdication of power from the parliament in favor of the administrative state or the bureaucracy formed by civil servants. Anyway, whatever the problems of the present division of power in Brazil, it is an illusion to think that we would find angelic creatures capable of control the political passions from above, and this is they could not solve these problems. How can one call for this type of decision in political issues? Thank you very much. Thank you, Leonidas, for your observation, and thank you for this topic of the judicialization or the politicization of the judiciary. And now we're going to listen to Ricardo Sonderman. Do it in business administration with an MBA in marketing, with a PhD in communication, and presently is the chairman of the International Churchill Society of Brazil, and is also the author of the book Churchill and the Science Behind the Speeches. Ricardo, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. Good evening, good afternoon. Once again, I want to thank our dear Jean Spad and his team for organizing this event. Oh, it's lovely, really, to be here. Personally, I hope that next year we won't have to wear masks. In fact, my president of Leonardis, my president Leonid Ton, he's a liberal. In fact, the number I entered after 1 hour we were in the microbus, but we were very few as liberals, and we have Robert Batista and here. João Pereira Coutinho. João, you asked asked a question. Is Brazil still this sleepy giant? And I was the last one to answer, but I had only 30 seconds. And I looked, I said, well, we will always be a market. With difficulty, we shall become a nation. And I spent a year thinking about this answer, João. And we'll start where I stopped. Well, I think that today Brazil is now at a terrible crossroads. On one side, we have a very brutal, uneducated president, from the words of Jogador Belo to Jogador Pelé. But he played a lot, and Romagnus said, be quiet, he's a poet. But it's important to remind that this in Bolsonaro administration, we established legal marks of sanitary measures. There was a moment in the general infrastructure of the country. There are very few cases of corruption. On the other side, we have rather gross ex-president who has the sympathy of the Europeans of the left because he was a unionist, he was a metalworker. But don't be deluded. He's really a thief. And there is a third way in dispute between two people who are very vain and arrogant. And as in the film, The Devil's Advocate, the most favorite sin of the devil is vanity. So our crossroad is terrible. The big decisions are taken at national level. They take a long time. They involve very complex negotiations, ideology, public corporativism, vanity, and but they do not obey basic principle of economics. But what matters are the relations made between citizens in the city. In this sense, we can do a lot of small changes which together could be great changes. It is the daily politics. It's simpler. It is more objective, less ideological, and the decisions are more transparent. This is how I can bring a bit of optimism. I come from the private world. During 40 years, I worked in the private sector, and I was invited to join a government. As a liberal, I would never participate, but the vice prefect was the president of Real, who was my vice president. When I was the president of the Institute Libertad, he insisted, he insisted, and I finally accepted. So what we did in Porto Alegre, which is about 1.5 million of inhabitants, 13,000 civil servants, 4 liberals in the government, the mayor, vice mayors, Ricardo Gomes, Vicente Perones, who organized the Forum Liberty, and me myself as the director for international relations. We started doing very simple things. It is a center left government, but the mayor managed to do a lot of things. The value of the human being is when we discover things that you cannot do, and when you find people who can do it. The mayor deals with social affairs, and he left the economic affairs with the vice mayor. The mayor calls us every day to ask us how to check on the situation. As the liberal in the trenches of the other day, we have the mission of generalize the public sector. We can see that there are very good people in the public sector, which were never called. My department is very small. How do you want to play? There's a poem of Mario Quintana, a great poet from Porto Alegre. He says, "We shall pass. I will pass. The team will remain." There are people there who have been there in 15 years. Never in 15 years how we should play in this department. So we have to treat people as human beings, because there's a lot of people who are not doing much. The cabinet of the mayor did one thing. He set up a group of lawyers and economists who deal with all the issues with no. Oh, so what did we do in Porto Alegre? We approved a law of economic liberty. More than 3,000 enterprises do not need an authorization. If you want to open a pet shop, for instance, you enter internet, you have the address, and one day you go and visit you to check if you're there. In the post-pandemic world, We have to work. We have to facilitate the life of the small entrepreneurs. We reduce the tax for innovation technology from 5 to 2%. But the federal law does not permit less tax. We have quite a lot of startups. We did reform in municipal providence, which and will be able to save 200 millions of euros after 4 years. We authorize the sale of the public company of buses. It will be sold or liquidated. We have a public enterprise of data processing. We broke its monopoly. We established a system of microcredit for these people who need this money to start working, to set up their own businesses. We we made a deal with Spain also for educating cities. We've been in Madrid, and we closed a deal to do the sales summit mm, between startups and great investment funds. And I'm here in Lisbon. In 2 weeks, I'll go to the Web Summit because we are in competition with Rio de Janeiro to have the South American version of the Web Summit. So we hope that Porto Alegre will win. So we be next to Lisbon, Kuala Lumpur, Toronto, and Porto Alegre will be the city of Latin America with an event of technology that you know very well. We are selling the Department of the Water Department. We are reforming the whole process of urban mobility. We have divided the whole city by areas and zones, and we are trying to um, of course, it's very difficult to change a country. You know that, Leonidas. It's a fantastic struggle, a combat. We can change our city, our communities, because we live in the city. If we have an objective, clear, liberal, conservative vision of strong action, of presence, we can change the life of people. So what do we now start seeing in Porto Alegre? That people start again their economic life. They are starting to be active again because I've been joining technology events for 6 or 6 years, web summits, technology and on. And a lot of people talk about the new technology. They talk about the chips to see inside the body. Talk about telemedicine. And the pandemic happened. From one day to the other, we went to home. We started working at home, and the world changed immediately. And it's completely changed. And I think that we have here two big groups of liberals. We have the thinkers and the doers. If we are thinkers, we cannot pass on ideas. The theory is one thing and practice is another. In practice, we give freedom to people to work without tutelage and without the control of the government. If we reduce the tax, people have got more money in their pockets. To conclude, when I was teaching at university, I gave a class on government and explained government in 30 seconds. I said, I told my students, well, please give, I want 10 euros from each of us. Everybody was staring at us. Well, come on, give me 10 euros. People started looking at the wallet. But, Professor, what are you going to do with 10 euros? Well, that's a good thing that you asked. And during the break, you can stay here. I go to the bar, and I bring your some food. How do you know, Professor, that I want some water, coffee, or tea, or cake, or something? But this is the government. It takes money from you. It wastes the way it thinks is best, regardless of of your wishes. So people are intelligent with money in their pockets and not with the money of the government. By doing this, we are reducing the necessity of presence of the government in the life of people. So we hope that there will be a better situation. In practice, we give freedom and responsibility. Freedom is not to do whatever you want. We give to people responsibility, and the public state power can do something which is essential: health, education, security, and infrastructures. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ricardo. Libro really is necessary in a government, as you can see. Our fourth speaker is not here, and we don't see him alive in São Paulo. Done a video for this session, and the fourth speaker is Luis Philippe Pondé, a philosopher. He writes for the Folha de São Paulo. He is the director of Labor. He is in the book São Paulo. I would like to. We're going to see the video of Professor Luis Philippe Pondé. Good afternoon to you all. Okay.
Mais uma vez no Estoril.
Good afternoon. It's great to be here again, although not in person. I hope next year I will be able to be in person with you. I thank Professor Spada's invitation and the partnership with Católica University. I thank João Pereira Coutinho, who's a colleague of mine in the Folha de São Paulo, and a special word of thanks to Ana Martins for having made possible a solution for the schedule issue I had, and that prevented me from being with you. So now we call it a synchronous activity. It's remote participation. Now, let me, in a quick presentation, say the following. This idea of challenges that Brazil, Latin America are facing in political terms, well, there is an ongoing challenge, not just to Brazil, but Latin America as a whole, and that remains today, and it will continue in the future. The absolute irrelevance of Latin America in geopolitics. Now, this irrelevance, it is not the same thing as economic relevance. They don't necessarily go together, politics and economy. Now, this irrelevance means that Latin America has no significant presence in no multilateral discussion. And actually, when Lula was president of Brazil, he tried in a rather clumsy way to mimetize a relevance of Brazil in Latin America and portray Brazil as a sort of a leader of Latin America. But it did not succeed because Brazil has no economic capacity to become a relevant country in geopolitics. Now, this is a constant challenge. It is not new. During the Cold War, Brazil was somewhat relevant in Latin America as well, due to the risk of contamination from the Cuban Revolution and the Soviet bloc. And the United States intervened massively, but after the Cold War, that relevance totally disappeared. Now, this is a first issue I wanted to, first point I'd like to stress. So, although this is ever present, but it's not much talked about, and I don't see any solution for this irrelevance in the near future, in this 21st century. Now, a second challenge, more specific about Brazil, and I will elaborate on this, is the problem caused by President Bolsonaro and his group, the so-called Bolsonarists, to what we can call a liberal and conservative intelligentsia in the country. The Jair Bolsonaro phenomenon, he appeared as a candidate in 2018. He was elected against the PT candidate. But the fact is that the Bolsonaro phenomenon, in a rather metaphoric way, stupefied the liberal and conservative intelligentsia in Brazil. Although I don't like the term, but we can say that the right became stupefied. Those that had or have a critical look at the history of PT in Brazil or the history of the left, the Bolsonaro phenomenon jeopardized this right. And in 2018, it already did that because it emptied the more liberal or central positions. It made those candidates unfeasible to defeat Haddad, the PT candidate in 2018. And that still happens today, not just in political and party terms, but also what we could call more mature public debate or internal debate in the groups that are identified as an opposition to the leftist vision of the world and the history of PT and its satellite parties. And why do I say this? Because first, many intellectual party staffers that are part of this liberal thinking and conservative thinking in Brazil, they ended up creating an identity with the Bolsonarist movement, and this public and political identity is a total disaster, because Bolsonarism represents the most stupid one can think about in terms of conservative tradition. It's very authoritarian. And one of the greatest sins of the Bolsonarist movement is that, in quotes, they gave reason to the PT discourse in 2018. Now, this is probably their most evident sin. Now, at the same time, the Bolsonarism phenomena raising in Brazil led to certain niche of debates that are totally noxious to public intelligentsia or intelligence. Debates about how one should do an art exhibition like this or like that. Cultural clashes, all in small detail about discussions like recent we have here in Brazil discussion about women's sanitary pads. This is a waste of time and energy. And Bolsonaro and Bolsonarism being the focus of this cultural war, and because this is something for kids, for immature people who debate in an irresponsible manner these issues. This has created problems to other important debates like slavery, racism. So there is an overall stupefaction of what was in the latest years when we tried to have a public intelligence that was not just PT and its next of kin. Bolsonarism also created a false relation with liberal trajectory. It created an incompetent government in the liberal viewpoint, and the problem we have here is liberal conservative intelligence, which is to reduce or to bring down the political discussion to minimal state discussion, as if the market could be built on high resolution for all types of problems. Another thing that Bolsonarism did, not just in Brazil, or that was they kind of sponsor, and they have sponsored throughout the pandemic, is the discussion also laughable about the idea of freedom. The freedom of not being vaccinated, which leads to production of false medical certificates and all scandals of corruption around the purchase of vaccines. Of course, Bolsonaro did not create corruption in the health system or in the Ministry of Health, because the Ministry of Health has always been a space of corruption in Brazilian history. But Bolsonarism, just like any group that is a newcomer to the party, wanted to take advantage of this market opportunity, which was the despair about the pandemic, despair about the vaccine, about buying vaccines. So the lack of organization that the Bolsonarist movement caused, or disorganization that they caused to a development of a public intelligence, liberal conservative intelligence in Brazil, may have this, by doing this, it could have happened 10 or 15 years ago. Younger people that came to the debate, they have partnerships with entrepreneurs that became true sponsors of a very right-wing speech that puts in question the understanding of liberty, of freedom, as Professor Espada says, identified with the representative democracy, with the institutions that guarantee a space of political and juridic and legal freedom, and the basic idea that freedom is built on a democratic state with respect for the constitution, respect for the institutions, and beyond any perfection that one cannot expect from those institutions. Another factor that was caused by or had an impact to the Bolsonarist thinking is very presence in the social media. A well-organized group, very organized, very aggressive, and they created these bubbles where words like conservatism, liberty, liberalism, they became synonyms of any kids' discussion. So What we are faced with is a general framework of this organization that was a negative factor because at the end of the day, it gave reason to the very criticisms that PT was making about Bolsonaro at that moment in time in 2018. So I hope that this confusion between liberal conservative tradition and religious identity that Bolsonaro and Bolsonarists will able to contaminate the conservative liberal intelligence. A very historic shame. Thank you.
Muito bem.
Okay. I'd like to thank Professor Pondé for his very assertive words. We have now some time for debate, for questions. Please raise your hands if you want to ask a question. Let's take 3 questions first. Please identify yourselves, be brief, and say who you are addressing your question to. Of course, Professor Pondé will not be able to answer. Good evening. Good evening. Professors, thank you, Professor Coutinho. Thank you, Professor Sutherland, Professor Roberto, and Mr. Batista. My question is to Dr. Batista and Dr. Zelmanovic about the attrition between institutions and the executive and legislative powers. The fact that there is this attrition between the executive and judicial power, should it not lead to a lesser power of both? How can we reinforce the power of the parliament that in the last years has lost this importance, is so relevant to the Brazilian democracy today? And the gentleman was reading a question at breakneck speed, making it impossible for us to interpret. Now, any more questions? My question is to all of the members of the panel. But could you tell us who you are? My name is Cynthia Barros. I'm a third year student. Now, the question is about what we have been following. The presidential elections will take place in 1 year. Is there the possibility of a third way to emerge that is less horrific than what we had in the previous election? Something other than Bolsonaro and PT. And one last question, at least in this round. Thank you to all speakers. It was very interesting. My name is João Loura. I'm a graduate student. Maybe the question is to all of you, maybe to Dr. Ricardo. You spoke about being liberal, and I like the civil society, and it's important about being liberal. My question is, for Portuguese standards, Brazil is a giant society. How can you unite such a different population, like people from São Paulo or people from the Northeast are quite different? How can we make the Brazilian society being proactive and unite when they are so different? Okay, let's have the answers. Leonidas, what can you tell us about this attrition or relation between the executive power and judiciary power? Well, it is up to the parliament to retrieve their protagonism. A good way to start would be to diminish the number of delegations that they sometimes grant, or they used to grant, to the administrative agencies. But my point is that it is also important to reject any call that a power has competencies above the constitutional competencies. And this, I believe, is the case today of certain actions of the Supreme Court in Brazil. A comment about the tragic options that we have, about the lack of alternatives. In my opinion, they kind of mask the fact that the number of incentives created by the second round in the elections, and the high number of parties making that the winning coalition will be constituted after the elections, not before the elections. So let me explain. Let's have on one side you have a radical left-wing corrupt, and on the right you have a full populist of the right. The two of them, to do anything, they have to negotiate with a majority that will be in parliament, and about which they have no control whatsoever. And this is good, because this gives power to the Brazilian parliament. And I think, for instance, in the United States, they don't have this. It is just to show you why I think that the Brazilian parliament has a certain power, and is that it has been useful for something to pass in the Brazilian parliament. There has reached a level of consensus that none of these two extremes alone can achieve. This is a good thing about Brazilian reality, in my opinion. Thank you, Leonidas. Antonio. Well, during my presentation, I was talking to Leonidas, when I said that it would be important for the checks and balances to work well, I was trying to be subtle. Well, basically, it's what he said afterwards. We are going through a stage of extrapolation of powers, namely those of the judiciary. And there is a reason to this, or there's a root to this. The Brazilian Constitution, despite its virtues, and it has quite a great deal of them in guaranteeing the fundamental rights and all that, but these guarantees sometimes are compromised due to the fact that it is so elaborate, it's so heavy. I don't know if you are aware of the Brazilian Constitution, but just to give you a hint, there is an article that says the following: College Pedro II in Rio will have to be federal. Now, why would a constitution say something about a school, a college? They have whole thematic codes in the Constitution. It comprises and contradictory aspects. So with a little rhetoric and imagination, you can decide anything you wish. And with a lot of rhetoric, judicial activism has arose in Brazil in an extraordinary way. So the federal court, federal tribunal, should be like a constitutional court, as in many countries. It is now meddling in everything. They even go to family feuds. if the lawyer is skillful and good, he can bring a family feud up to the Supreme Federal Court. Sergio Moro, the famous judge that was the leader of the Lava Jato case against Lula. Well, he had a project that did not come about. He used to say that the end of a lawsuit was like a fiction in Brazil, and it's true. Recently, a friend of mine, asked, how far should I take this suit? And the lawyer said, as far as you wish, as long as you wish. So it's endless, and therefore such an abhorrent discussion. So judicial activism is a very serious problem. The other problem was clientelism. Our parliament is very used to this clientelism. They don't get what they wish. There's always if I don't get what I want, the government proposal will not be passed. But the good news is that countries in Latin America, those that are more structured, today there are entrepreneurs that are coming together to work on proposals to improve the governance, the democratic governance, and this has to be worked in the future. Ricardo?
Deixar mais difícil para o fim, tá?
I leave the best to the end, but I think it's very interesting what Ponde is saying. I always think, but Nelson Rodrigues, as playwright, writer, he said, fools will take over the world, not because of their capacity, but because of their quantity. There are a lot of them. Brazil has an education process of 50 years. For the past 50 years, is getting worse. Our production, our numbers in the PISA rates are the worst. We have in Paulo Freire, the Brazilian educator, that if you read, go to the internet and look for quotes by Paulo Freire. If anyone can understand him, I'll give you a prize. And this created a mass of teachers, educators that cannot teach, and so people today they don't know anything. And when Ponde says the poor, the ill use of being conservative and being liberal, is because we have increased the number of people that think they are conservative and liberals, but not knowing what they are because they cannot read. They read the text and they cannot understand what's written. They just send a little word and they say, "Oh, I'm that. I'm like that," and so that's it. The third way. There is no third way. You cannot create it unless either Lula or Bolsonaro quit. If one of them quits, then someone else may come up. Because then there will be an election either against Lula or against Bolsonaro. There are several names, but none has the potential to get to the second round. Oh, Churchill said, I can always swallow my words, it will not cause me a heartburn. So I may be wrong, but the struggle will have to be in the Brazilian government. We have liberals, Alimatar, Paluedo, Gustavo El, Wagner Lenhart, and many changes were brought about. And in the municipality of Porto Alegre, that's 4. Now, if you are able to elect 10% of the various chambers in Parliament, that will be 50 MPs, federal MPs, and then each state parliament will add between 4 to 6 MPs, liberal conservative MPs, and that will be sufficient people to be present in all committees where evil deeds are done, and you can stop or prevent them from happening. And what my colleague was saying, if you have this block of this kind of firewall that prevents these mistakes to become laws, you can improve politics a lot, because whoever is president, they can do nothing without the Congress, without the Senate. We have what we call the centron, the central block. The central block devours everything around it. So if you have, say, 10%, and that number again is a Winston Ling that came to that figure. If you have 10%, you can be present in all relevant committees, and you can legislate better. The government is not so important here, much less important than to be able to elect other people like Marcel van Hatten and several MPs that have more meaningful stance. So there is a solution, but there are 36 parties. It's a crazy samba. No one knows the lyrics. So we have to conquer little by little and making sure that the evil deeds become law, because then it would be too late. So we have to stop it from at birth.
Queria saber como motivar, eu acho que é isso.
How to motivate? Give a solution that you can change. It's a huge country. I live in Rio Grande do Sul, the northeast. It's like a different country to us. But Portugal is a small country, but then if you live in the south, you're different from if you live in the north or somewhere else in the north. The differences, there will always be differences, but it's important to have a union of common objectives.
Pois muito bem, cabe-me a mim encerrar esta.
Going to close this session. I'm going to start by thanking all the speakers for their words, for their comments. I'm sure we shall meet again, especially in 1922. It was really a hot year for Brazilian politics. I'd like to send hugs to friends in Brazil, Bruno Gertrugen in São Paulo, in Porto Alegre, and hope that we can meet again either here or over there. Good evening, have a good dinner.